People don't have to tell me, oh, you're a caring person. I'm of the belief, when you treat people right and when you treat them wrong. When you're showing care and when you're not.
Welcome, everyone, to Culture by Design. This is Tim Clark, and I have with me today an amazing guest, Bobbye Sweat. Bobbye, thanks so much for being on the podcast. I'm so looking forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invite.
Bobbye Sweat is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for First Command Financial Services in Fort Worth, Texas. Before joining First Command in 2020, she brought over 16 years of diversity and inclusion leadership experience to her current role. Prior to First Command, Bobbye was D&I Integration Director for Hallmark Cards, Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Mercedes-Benz Financial Services, Senior Manager Diversity and Inclusion at JCPenney, Associate Director Diversity and Inclusion at AT&T, and Senior Manager Network Services and Customer Care Operations at the Boeing Company. Bobbye received her MBA in Total Quality Management from City University of Seattle. She is a certified diversity professional and certified 4 stages of psychological safety consultant. Bobbye, that's quite a tour of duty, I must say. So how many industries have you worked in?
Oh, about 6.
About 6.
Yes, and I left Telecom and came back to Telecom. So if you count that, it's about 7 times around. Yeah.
I want to start with, we'll come back to your professional life, but I want to go back to your origin story. I would love for you to share with me and with the listeners where you came from, where you grew up, how you grew up, what life was like. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. And again, thank you for having me, Tim. So I'm a small town country girl from the state of Arkansas. I was actually born in Northeast Arkansas. I was born with 3 siblings, raised by a single dad. My mom died when I was 10 years old, and she actually left 4 kids, 11 and under. So we're kind of like stair-step children. And so my dad was left alone raising 4 kids. He was a farmer, and he never remarried. And I think for me, that was probably the most unique experience. Being raised in the late 60s, 70s by a single dad in rural Arkansas was no small feat. He was a farmer, and there was 2 things that was very important to my dad for his children, and that is to get an education and to really, based on, his knowledge of being not only a father, but a mom to 4 kids, it was so important to him for us to learn what caring was all about. And he taught us really the importance of relationships. And he'd always have a saying that if you can't get along with each other, how can you get along with anyone else? And so I think for me personally, being raised by a single dad and him instilling in me and my siblings of how to care for each other. And when I think about the concept of how he intended for us to care for one another and relate that to caring for others outside of our homes, it is something that it has to be embedded in you, right? Of how to treat people. And he showed us how to do that. He'd always use metaphors, and he was very good of trying to explain life to us, but in a way for children to understand. And one of the things he'd always say, kids, if you can't get along with each other, you'll never get along with how on earth are you expected to get along with other people. So I think that was really the foundation of what I brought into my work life, my professional life, of really knowing authentically caring was all about.
Bobbye, how old were you when your mother died?
Yeah, I was 10. I have a twin sister. So my twin and I were 10. My brother was 9. And my sister was going to turn 12 in September. She died in May.
Even at that age, though, how conscious were you of the fact that your situation was perhaps different than a lot of folks?
Yeah, absolutely. being raised in a small town, it's a small country town, like I say, in Northeast Arkansas. And, one of the things I want to point out about my upbringing also, being from the state of Arkansas, I say this jokingly today that that little town could have been the poster city or the postal municipality for how to get along with people that are different from you. So it was unique, Tim, in that community kind of had this sense of caring. So it was not just caring inside of our home. And we knew that we did not have a mom. As a matter of fact, we were reminded of that quite frequently, especially when we looked around and saw our friends, the family intact, the mom, the dad, and the kids. And so going to school, we were aware that, we didn't have a mom. My dad worked as a farmer. He couldn't come to the school like my mom could, right, for meetings with the teachers and things like that. So from that standpoint, we knew that there was a void. But at the same time, again, when you think about that caring and community, we had teachers that kind of fill the void of motherhood for us in terms of helping girls, especially. My dad would say that he struggled the most because he had 3 girls and a boy to raise. And the girls were the oldest. And so we probably gave him the greatest challenge than the boy.
Yeah, raising 3 daughters, yeah.
So we coined him as being Mr. Mom. And it was kind of fun growing up with him as we got older. We would send him not only Father's Day's card, but we would send him Mother's Day's cards as well, right? And we called him Mr. Mom.
So, Bobbye, it seems to me that your father was an extraordinary man. Here you are, this is the 60s and the 70s. You're in rural Arkansas, and he's raising 3 daughters and a son. He's teaching his son chivalry. He's teaching his children mutual respect. He's teaching them the fundamentals of getting along and relating and communicating. Where did he come from?
Yeah.
Your dad figured some things out, or he had some things figured out a long time ago. How did that happen?
And he was an only child. So his mom died when he was quite young. And he was actually raised by his mom's sister, who had, I think it was 7 of them. So he was raised in a home with 7 first cousins. And believe it or not, we never knew them to be first cousins because we were growing up calling them all uncles and aunts. We thought those were his siblings, but really they weren't. I think my dad, he migrated to where we were raised in Arkansas in the early 20s. And when you think about the early 20s in Arkansas, and these are some things that we found out after he died in 1994, that some of his friends who just so happened to be white, right? Other farmers, they grew up together as boys, as kids together in the community. And that's who his friends were. And so I think Dad had a knack for understanding. And when I recall some of the things that he used to say, people are people, we're all human. And I think for the most part, he learned early about seeing a person's humanity first and then look at, how different one might be. But he was raised in the town that we were raised in. And so he kind of knew everyone. He kind of, as he said, hey, I knew those guys when we were all boys. So it's almost like he knew he was dealing with someone who physically may have looked different, but in terms of, the upbringing, their knowledge versus his knowledge, he knew that they were all the same in terms of humans, and they treated each other with dignity and respect.
They treated each other that way. So the racial integration was very real.
That's right. When my mom died, it was amazing how the entire community, while it was small, other families coming to my dad, son, just let us know what we can do to help with the kids. And these were people from across all spectrums, Black and white. So growing up in that type of environment, and I was asked once, when did I first experience racism, right? And I really had to get myself out of, after high school, going to college before, when you think about racism as it looks today, because the community I was raised in was not about that. Now, was there races there? Absolutely, probably was, but the community as a whole did not tolerate it.
So it was a pretty nurturing community.
Absolutely. And I'm proud to say that my friends from high school today, we try to get together at least once a year. My brother and his class, my older sister and their class try to get together. And, because of the relationship that we had as children, right? As childhood. I remember when the schools were integrated, or we could actually go to school with our friends, the kids that we were raised up with. Our moms were friends.
You lived through that.
And we lived through that. And so when schools actually integrated, it was like, okay, now we're going to school together. We didn't have to kind of be in an environment where we felt uncomfortable or different because we had friends. We had white friends that we played with every day before actually being able to go to school with them.
Bobbye, you're giving us hope here.
When I go back and meet up with my classmates, and they know I do diversity and inclusion work, I tell them I use Wiener as an example in some of the examples of how people should treat each other. And it's really not about the times you're in. It's about humanity. It's, from inception, we're all human. And so if you can look at people and meet them where they are, and that's what fascinates me about this work, learning how to meet people where they are and understanding, that we're all the same. We have some differences, but that's a good thing.
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Let's move into your professional life a little bit. Where did you start in professional life? And talk to us about some of maybe the formative experiences that you had early on that helped you build your foundation, because you've been so extraordinarily successful as a DEI leader, and even beyond that as just a leader in organizations. But maybe share some of that early experience with us.
Absolutely. Be glad to. So when I was a junior in college, I was working part-time with Telecom, and I guess it's okay to say Southwestern Bell Telephone Company. And my goal at that time, Tim, was really to be a teacher. And I was working part-time to, help get myself through college and everything. And I was approached my junior year to consider looking at the company's internal leadership development program, right? And so I was approached to consider going into our engineering department. Now, I was not an engineer major at the time. I wanted to be a teacher. But, the telephone company at the time was notorious for their leadership development. And so for me, that was an opportunity. And I had to really weigh, do I take this full-time job in engineering, right, and pursue a career this way, or do I finish school? This is where mentoring comes in, and mentoring and caring. There was a gentleman there who really kind of took me under his wings, right? And helped me understand that you can get a degree later if that's what you want to do. But here, look at the great opportunities, and especially the times where we're in. And so I decided to take the opportunity to go into engineering. And I think professionally, that's when my career started. Again, having so many people in the business world that not only took interest in you, I went into my work with two things in mind. And I got this from my dad. My dad always said, if you have the attitude to learn and the aptitude, you can do anything you can do anything you want. And I think for me, I have always gone into any opportunity with those two things in mind. I feel like that I can learn, right? I have the aptitude to learn, and I have the attitude to do whatever it takes to.
That's the formula.
That's the formula, attitude and aptitude. And so I was an engineer, and that was a great learning experience for me, because at the time it was where women were not in those traditional roles as engineers for the telephone company. So for me, that was, I think, the first African-American female engineer in Northeast Arkansas for the telephone company. Yeah. And I knew at the time all eyes were on me, right? That how I perform would determine the next person of color
what happens after.
That's right. Absolutely.
How did that feel? Did you interpret that, Bobbye, as an opportunity, or was it high stress and pressure? What was that like for you?
It was truly an opportunity because I knew I had options going in. I didn't have to stay in it, right? If it was that much of pressure or even, and remember, there was probably, I was only one of two females in this group at the time. The other female was white. And so, going into those roles with predominantly men and predominantly white men, I guess there could have been some pressure, but it wasn't visible. And I think for me, the engineering work group was comprised of younger and older engineers. And I just so happened to gravitate towards the older ones. And I don't know if it's because they were more like dads, right? Or opposed to my younger peers, that I was working alongside. But I tell you, the district manager, when he interviewed me, he said these two things. He said, if you want to learn this job, I will teach you everything you need to know about this job and give you not only the tools, but the information you need to be successful. And for me personally, that's all I needed to hear. And when I think about those words that was said to me in the mid 70s, and when you think about today's environment, Tim, about providing employees the resources, the tools, the resources they need to be successful, it's been around since, day. It's just how do you leverage and take advantage of opportunities like that?
It sounds to me as if, Bobbye, that event, that experience, when that gentleman said that to you, those were words of reassurance. And that was a hinge point for you. That was a turning point where you felt confident that you could do it with that support, and you felt that support. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And I think for me, I went into that environment not really feeling really intimidated by being the only one. And I think that was because of how I was raised and where I was raised. I was raised around people who were different from me. So even though I was one of two females, I didn't go in with this mindset of, oh, all eyes are going to be on me, or every mistake I make, right, will be viewed as not being capable of it, because I learned very early in that everybody makes mistakes. We all make mistakes. And so I didn't allow my mistakes be a deterrent whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly. So then how did it go?
It went well. I spent about 2.5, 3 years in engineering. And as I say, I was part of their development program, right? And I tell you, starting in engineering with the phone company, and then when I look at the progression of my career going from engineering, and this is where, the facilities are actually designed, right? And how they're laid out, and then construction putting them in. But from engineering, I actually went to the maintenance side of the business. So not only did I design the plant, I had an opportunity to lead the groups that were actually installing and maintaining the facilities to make communications and telephones work. So from that, it was just a progression across. I tell people all the time, I worked for the same company for almost 18 years, and I think I had 7 or 8 jobs, and it was like working for 7 or 8 different companies. So you had the opportunity to learn the business, from end to end across the business. And from there, it took me to the aerospace. I had an opportunity.
So this is when you went to Boeing?
This is when I went to the Boeing company, because at the time, the Boeing company had the 19th largest private telecommunications network in the country. And so basically what that meant was they did all of their telephone provisioning. The only thing that they got from the telcos were the backhaul facilities, right? So for as installing phones for our internal customers, and maintaining the networks, they did that for themselves. And so I was actually hired. They were trying to automate their records, right, to automate their dispatch. And so I actually had an opportunity to do that for the company. I shared a story outside, and this is a great example of going into a job, putting your head down and doing that job to the best of your ability. And there was a guy said something to me at Boeing that stuck with me. He said, you don't try to impress those of us up here. It's your peers that are going to be measuring how you're performing. And I say this, and I don't tell this story, and I know this is probably going worldwide, but an example of just doing the job, to the best of your ability. And so cycle time was very important. And so when I got there, the cycle time of just getting our end users' telephones was just off the chain, right? It took almost 43 days to get a phone installed. And so because I believe of my analytical mindset, right, I want to know why it took so long. And over a course of, I believe, 12 or 18 months, we had the cycle time down to 7 days.
From 43?
That's right. And it was the problem is back then, it was called batch printing, right? The orders that the field needed were the last batch of orders that were being printed. And so you had people sitting in the office just twiddling their thumbs for the orders, for the work that they needed to put assignment on to go out to the field. And so I just work collaboratively with our programmer and ask questions. I love, having a degree in total quality management. I was asking those 5 why questions. Well, why are all these non-touchable? We don't need these orders. Why are they being printed first? And the response was, oh, well, they can print last. I said, well, do they have to print it all? And they said, no, we could suppress the print. And that was the root cause of the cycle time being so bad. It was the printing. It was not the work getting to the people that needed to work in time. And we reduced the cycle time down to 7 days. That was one of the greatest cycle time and quality stories that I had the privilege to really boast about throughout my career at Boeing, because finding the root cause of the problems, right, and eliminating those non-value added steps in every process. So I had a great career, not only at the telco, but Boeing was no exception. I learned a lot. Now, we could never say at Boeing that we were telephone. We provided telecommunication services because we were an airplane company, right? So it's just culture. If someone asks those of us in the Telecom Shared Services division, what did we do? We build airplanes. And really and truly we did, because we were supporting the engineers and everybody out in the field across the globe, right, with services to enable them to do their job. So we were never noted as a telephone company. We build airplanes.
You built airplanes, even though you were working on that side of the business.
That's right. We build airplanes.
So then, Bobbye, you transitioned to maybe the 3rd chapter or the 3rd act of your career, and you go into D&I. So or DE&I, depending on how we framed it back then versus how we frame it today. But how did you do that? How did that come about to go into this area of work?
Yeah, absolutely. It was while I was at Boeing, because I was a senior manager of network services. So I had call center and our network operations center, which was very large, right? Very large operations. And one of the things that really struck me as a leader is that, sure, we had a diverse workforce, but people were not talking with one another. They were not talking to one another. Now, they were getting the work done, right? But I found it strange that when I walked through our call center, and at the time we probably had over 150 people at any given time in the call center, people were not collaborating or talking, when time was conducive for that.
You could physically watch this happen.
You could just watch. People were not engaging at all. It was just heads down, not learning from one another or anything. And so as a leader, and I talked to my peers I said, we're missing something. I said, there's a lot of knowledge in this organization, but how do we get people to begin to share and start learning from one another? So that really put me on that journey, Tim, of what body of knowledge, right, from a leadership standpoint, are we missing? How do we get people to look at each other and leverage our differences? And you can't do that unless you talk with someone, have a conversation with others. And so that really put me on the journey of looking for a body of knowledge to help close some of those gaps. As much and as many leadership training that we were giving, I just felt like something was missing. And at the time, when you think about DE&I.
What did you call it back then, by the way?
I didn't call it diversity and inclusion. I didn't know what to call it.
Yeah, we didn't have that. We didn't have that terminology, right?
No, it was only in higher ed, academia, and the government, I think, is where diversity, I don't think they even talked about inclusion. It was diversity in the government. But what I did, I just started searching for learning around culture and inclusion. And I found this outfit out of San Francisco, right? That was offering a certification in diversity and inclusion. And I said, my God, what is that, right?
So what year are we at now, Bobbye?
This was in 2005.
Okay.
This is after I left the Boeing company and came back to the telephone company, right? And so I actually spent probably a year and a half. There was at that time, it's much more condensed now, which is good. People can kind of get it at a faster rate than I did. But it took me almost a year and a half to go through all three levels of the certification because I really wanted to know not only at the operational, but from a strategic standpoint, how does this play into an organization's overall strategy, right? When you think about people and culture and things like that. So I was fortunate enough to get my certification. And while I was not able to do it when I left Boeing and come back to the telephone company, came back into marketing, but I still had that desire to learn more about this space, right? From an organizational standpoint. And had an opportunity to do some outside work, on a part-time basis to really understand how to teach it and how to train other people around it. But then I believe in 2007, I had an opportunity to do the work full-time at AT&T to actually lead the mobility organization. And at the time, I think there were over 77,000 employees. And when you think about that company at the time, 300 plus thousand employees throughout the world and companies within company, it was totally different culture. So I was supporting our mobility and customer services side of the business at the time, which the workforce was much younger opposed to the legacy part of the business. And so strategy wise, we had to have a different strategy of how do we manage people from all across the business. And so that gave me an opportunity to do the work at AT&T, I think for about 5 years.
So Bobbye, did this, as you moved into DEI, was this just something that just lit you on fire?
It absolutely did. And it kind of solidified everything that I've learned throughout my whole entire managerial journey and really linking it to the business.
Okay, now that's critical. We often don't do that. We have to link it to the business, to business outcomes at the organizational level and to career outcomes at the individual level.
Absolutely. There's a lot of passion around this work. And when I hear people say, oh, I want to do D&I because I have passion. Well, that's good, but you have to have a purpose. When you're dealing within the organization, you have to show the purpose of this work. And it's really about, from a business standpoint, not only performance, but how do we continue to grow the business? We have to know how to embed not only diversity, which I truly believe that inclusion, right, should be the primary focus, because if organizations are truly inclusive, right, the diversity, equity, and all the other byproducts of inclusion will happen.
It's going to happen, isn't it?
I believe that now. I have a lot of peers in this space and some don't agree with me, but that's okay, right? It's not only meeting people where they are, but meet organizations where they are as well.
Well, I think it has to be the foundation though, Bobbye.
Absolutely.
If you don't put a foundation of inclusion in place, where are we going? I don't know how you build if that's not there. That's kind of your footings and your foundation.
You have to have an inclusive environment, because I don't believe any organization could ever recruit themselves to a sustainable, diverse workforce. It will never be sustainable unless you have a culture where your policies, practices, and systems are working for everyone.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Bobbye, let's talk a little bit about leadership themes, or I guess I would say the key principles that have guided your career. You've worked in 6 or 7 different industries. You've been an executive leader. You've worked with people from all over the world. You've managed thousands of people. What are some big takeaways? What do you want to pass on? What do you want to say to even really the next generation about leadership, about culture? What's your legacy? What do you want to pass on?
Yeah. So thanks. Great question. You've heard me say more than once since we've been talking about meeting people where they are. I think that stands true also to meet organizations where they are. And I think you can do that by showing that you authentically care, right? And when I think about, what my dad instilled in me as a young child about learning how to care for each other inside our home, right? And one of my best quotes is by Theodore Roosevelt. And I couple his quote, with what my dad said: you must care for one another. And his quote is, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And I think it's those two things, right, that have really stuck with me and has really guided me in my leadership capacity to just not only meet people in organizations where they are, but they have to know that you care. People really must know that you genuinely care for them. Those two principles have guided me. And I think when you think about what are some of the attributes of not only showing that you care, it kind of goes back to culture, right? Again, you have to have a culture where not only you can show it, not only you can talk about it, but you can demonstrate it, that you care for people. And I think I struggle a lot. Some organizations think you have to do these great big things, right, to show people that you care about them. And at the end of the day, people just, there's these small acts of caring and inclusion that you can show first by showing gratitude. And you can do that in, so many ways, not only full-blown recognitions, but just saying thank you for a job well done and saying it sincerely, that you really appreciate what people are doing on a daily basis.
It's so interesting to hear you say that, Bobbye, because I think for most human beings, these small acts of appreciation and gratitude it's better than money.
It is.
Yes, we all need to live and provide for ourselves, and we live in a temporal world, but the gratitude is better than money in the long run, and it really binds us together. Now, one of the things that strikes me about who you are and your approach, Bobbye, is that you seem to be agnostic about people's demographics and psychographics and their characteristics that we are very important. They're very important, but it doesn't seem to matter to you. You're not going to treat anybody differently. But I wanted to ask you this question. Inevitably, as you go through professional life, and you're going to have some experiences and some situations where people are not nice.
That's right.
And they're not kind. So how have you learned to repay unkindness with kindness? Because you are that kind of person. How have you learned to do that?
That's a great question. And Tim, the only way I can explain that to you is really going back to one of the nuggets that my dad taught us, right? I mean, growing up, as kids, you have disagreement with people. And if you relate that to the workplace, and yes, everybody's not going to, want to get along with you, and you will face obstacles throughout, your career. But he would always say, if you're not getting along with someone, the best thing to do is to remove yourself, right? Sometimes you have to step back. And so always try to do the opposite of what's happening to you, right? So if someone's, just really dogging you out, you can change that by just responding the opposite. Don't dog them back. As my dad used to say, a person can't fight with themselves or argue with themselves, right?
So remove yourself and they're left to themselves.
One of the things he used to say, especially about physically, altercations, he said, if you can walk away from a fight, you won the fight.
I love it.
If you can walk away from the fight, you won the fight, because an individual can't fight with themselves. So you won the fight. And I kind of use that. I mean, now for me, I can think about some times when not speaking up was not the right thing to do, right? In terms of really being an advocate or an ally about a certain topic. But I think for me, it's just pick your battles.
It raises a related question, Bobbye, and that is, you're going through life, sometimes you have to remove yourself, You're rewarding unkindness with kindness. How do you strike this balance to you're forgiving people along the way, but at the same time, as you just said, you have to stand up for yourself? How do you do both of those things? How have you personally figured out how to do those things?
Yeah.
People need help with that.
Personally, I always felt like forgiving is easier than holding grudges for me personally, because if I forgive, I'm moving on. If I'm holding a grudge, for me mentally, I may be thinking about, well, what am I going to do? Or how am I going to respond? Right.
You don't carry it with you. You don't have some big backpack full of grievances.
I cannot afford to let that type of weight be on my shoulders. I try to let it go. I really do. And now sometimes that could be good and sometimes it'd be not so good, because not so good, especially, earlier in my career, I joke about this. It was expected for me to behave like some of the other leaders that I work with, especially in this male dominated work environment, engineering and construction. I would have never made it. I came up in a time when, to get your way, you turned over tables and you stood on tables, you bammed the tables. And I would sit there and say, I can only be successful if I do this. This is not going to work for me.
So, Bobbye, did you feel that you were at times held to a different standard?
No, not necessarily held to it. I held myself to a different standard. I sure did. Right.
And it worked.
It worked because, like I say, at the end of the day, you have to, when I would leave my office some days, I would ask myself, what did I do today to serve others, right? Especially from a customer standpoint. And being in operations where, you walk in the morning, you've got hundreds of customer complaints and trouble reports, you're trying to get them solved. But I would always, when I would get to my car, I always say, what did I do today to serve someone else, right? And knowing that customer services was back, customers had their services back, the workforce was doing good. That's how I judge my day, every day. How did I perform? And from a customer standpoint, both internally and externally.
So let me ask you another related question. The golden thread, or at least one of the golden threads that you pull through your career, is authentic caring.
That's right.
And how do you do that, Bobbye, when that's a matter of intent, right? That's a matter of motivation. That's a matter of valuing people, regarding people, esteeming people. It's the way that you view people. It's what you believe about them. How did you maintain that authentic caring when sometimes people are pretty hard to work with, right? They're pretty hard to work with. But how did you maintain that?
Well, I've always felt that I can cite example after example of how people thought I was going to respond to something, and I responded just the opposite. And it kind of like blows their mind. It just blows their mind.
What would be an example?
Okay, so I used to manage this center. It was a maintenance center where, we were taking all the trouble reports for customers. And there was levels of technical skills, and the higher skilled employees, right, were the, you do as I say, not as I do type of mentality. They were going to do what they wanted to do, right? Now, as a leader, you're expected to do your job. And so I remember this one particular gentleman who was just determined to do things his way. And, customers would call in and ask for status, and he's the only one could give us status. And you ask him, and he had this saying, Tim, that says, when I get around to it. And so once he said, when I get around to it, you were expected to turn and walk away. And so this is how I dealt with this. I actually worked with my communications group, and I had some coffee things you put coffee cups on, right? Made a little round.
Oh, yeah. Like a coaster.
A coaster, exactly. And on it, it said a round to it.
Oh, really?
Every time he would say that, I would give him a round to it, a coffee coaster. It really became a ritual within that center, right? Because nobody wanted a round to it, because his round to its would stack up. And over time, you saw his round to its go down, right? Because he became more responsive. Now, I could have handled that totally different. I not only gave him around to it, but anytime someone said, I get around to it, I would give them around to it. So it became almost a culture ritual, right? And so I could have done just the opposite, demanded or commanded him to do X, Y, and Z, and I wanted done.
Because you were the boss.
Because I was the boss, I could have easily reacted that way. But what I was really trying to do is to get him to see that we're all in this thing together, right? And so if the overall results are different, how that impacted not only me, but how it impacted him as well from his performance as well. So,
Did you get him to smile, Bobbye?
did he ever smile?
Yeah.
He thought it was quite funny. He thought it was comical.
That's what I mean. So you responded with a creative approach that brought humor, that brought some joy and laughter into the situation, and probably helped him put his guard down a little bit.
That's right.
Become a little bit more self-aware, a little bit more willing, and make some changes.
Because I genuinely cared about how he was performing.
Yeah. Pretty incredible story. I do want to ask you about the importance of a speak up culture, because I know how much this matters to you, but this is a scary thing for many people to get to the point where they can speak up, and yet they have so much to offer, so much value to contribute, but they don't feel that they can. What have you learned about creating that kind of culture, Bobbye? Because I think in this post-pandemic world now, this is something that not only people want to do, but I think a lot of people are constantly asking the question, is there a voice with that job? Do I have a voice with that? Does a voice come with that job? And they look at that as a requirement. They absolutely feel that that is a human right almost, that I need a voice. I need to be heard. So how do we do that?
Well, again, it kind of goes back to meeting organizations, right, where they are from a cultural standpoint. You can't expect people to speak up if the culture isn't conducive, right? Or if it isn't, as you say, if it isn't designed for people to feel comfortable speaking up. And I think for me, when you think about a speak up culture, you have to have those other three from a psychological safety standpoint. The inclusion, people have to feel like they're included, they're valued, right? And that they're learning, they can contribute. And so if you have to have those other three before you can really have this true speak up type of culture, which, equates to challenger safety when you think about that. And so for me, I kind of take it back to being authentic, and I'll take it even further, say authentically care about people within the culture. And people have to trust you, that when you say it's okay to speak up, that they trust that when you say that you mean it, right? That you can't just say, oh, speak up. And then when you speak up, then they're punished for speaking up. So for me, it's baby steps, incremental steps in creating a truly speak up type of culture. And it starts with trust. It starts with caring and making people really feel comfortable that it is, you want them to speak up. They have to speak up, especially when it is to improve, whether it's a process, a business decisions or whatever, just even within your small group. If you have a nugget of information that's going to improve something, you should feel safe to do that.
People need to see evidence that when they do and when others do, that they'll be rewarded for that. As you say, baby steps, little by little, they're going to say, okay, I'm going to register a point of view and we'll see what happens.
And I think when people see other folks doing it, right, especially within your team, your immediate team, I think that's where people begin to feel more comfortable. If they're not being punished for speaking up, then I shouldn't be punished for speaking up. And I think that's how you can really get it truly embedded.
Bobbye, as we conclude our conversation, I'm wondering if you could just share the experience that you had at Boeing years ago when you got a bonus. Would you share that story with us?
I would be glad to share it. Again, I don't share it a lot, but I think it's a great example of doing your job, right? Not trying to get on any particular person's radar in terms of being noticed. Just do your job. And it kind of goes back to what I told you, the gentleman said to me, it's not those of us up here you need to impress, it's the people across. So this was a time when it was my first year and a half on the job where I was successful in reducing the cycle time of getting orders out the door from 40 plus days to 7 days, right? And I was never part of the executive meetings at that time, but apparently the executives were asking, what happened? What happened? How did this happen, right? Is it really for real? Can we depend on what we're seeing here? And so once that explained, so at Boeing, there was this internal process, as I came to understand it, that the executives on a quarterly basis could just actually give each other a bonus for doing a great job, right? And that was just, just part of that culture, I guess, at that level. So I was in my office one day. As a matter of fact, it was almost at the end of the day. And my executive came to my office, spoke, and I was a little surprised and spoke, and he handed me an envelope. And he just said, I want to thank you for a job well done. Appreciate your work. And I opened the envelope, and it was actually a check for half of the bonus that he would get.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, it was for $7,500. And so that really stuck with me because, like I say, I was there about a year and a half. And I said, gosh, if all I have to do is do my job right to get this kind of reward, I am in. I am in like Flynn. So, like I say, I don't boast about that. But for me, it was a solidification of doing your job to the best of your ability. And people see the results. And, and that was just one way of being rewarded for that.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, Bobbye, I am so grateful for your time. I'm grateful for your insights, for everything that you've shared, and for the theme of authentic caring, which I think began with your father.
Yes.
And you've carried it through. And so that's the legacy.
That's right.
I think that's the legacy that you're going to leave in all of these organizations.
People don't have to tell me, oh, you're a caring person. I'm of the belief, when you treat people right and when you treat them wrong. When you're showing care and when you're not. But even in my personal life, I try to do the same thing. I treat people and let them know that I care about them. Not only people that I know, people that I don't know. It has to start someplace, and we have to be the light of the type of world we want to live in. And I think if more people, would do the same, I think our world would be a better place of just authentically caring.
There's no question. Bobbye, thank you for a delightful conversation.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for listening.
Okay. Thanks for joining me today on the Culture by Design podcast. Be sure to subscribe and listen to new episodes every week. And if you'd like to see more of the work we're doing, go to leaderfactor.com.